This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening, everyone. We begin tonight with how the world has reacted to the President's State of the Union address. It was, if you heard it, in large measure what Mr. Bush believes should be done about or to Saddam Hussein. The President said it again today on the road. The U.S. must deal with the Iraqi leader before it is too late. The administration is advancing the idea today that this debate about attacking Iraq is in the final phase. ABC's Terry Moran is at the White House. Terry?
Peter, officials here say that there is a window of diplomacy now that will last only for weeks, not months. And the administration intends to use that time by pressuring allies hard and by providing some new proof of its charges.
In Michigan today, the president drove home his warning, so far undocumented, about Saddam Hussein forming an alliance with al-Qaeda.
There's now a shadowy terrorist network which he could use as a forward army, attacking his worst enemy and never leave a fingerprint behind.
And Mr. Bush forcefully rejected the notion that aggressive weapons inspections might be able to contain and deter Saddam Hussein.
In my judgment, you don't contain Saddam Hussein. You don't hope that therapy will somehow change his evil mind. That you deal with Saddam Hussein. I hope we can do this peacefully.
That may now depend on the course of diplomacy at the United Nations, where a tense Security Council meeting was held today, and where once again allies called for more time for inspectors and for more evidence from the U.S.
We would like to see undeniable proof. Okay?
Iraq flatly rejected the charge that it has links to al-Qaeda.
I absolutely deny that, and I challenge Bush and his government to present any evidence of that.
Substantiating the U.S. charges will be the job of Secretary of State Colin Powell, who will go to the UN next Wednesday to lay out a case against Iraq using some newly declassified evidence. Powell also said the U.S. is now prepared to facilitate one option which could prevent a war: exile for Saddam Hussein.
If he were to leave the country and take some of his family members with him and others in the leading elite, we would, I'm sure, try to help find a place for them to go.
At the UN Security Council, there's a move afoot to get a second UN resolution that would give Iraq a deadline and only then authorize force. And in Congress, Senator Edward Kennedy introduced a measure calling on the president to come back to Congress for authorization to use force only after he proves that the threat from Iraq is imminent. On both scores, Peter, the White House is not inclined to go along.
Thanks, Terry. Terry Moran at the White House today. As you heard there from the Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq, they dismissed the allegations out of hand, and several of America's allies are still skeptical about the evidence the president talked about last night. Not the British. Britain today became the first country to join President Bush in making the connection between Iraq and al-Qaeda. ABC's Martha Raddatz is at the State Department. That was good news for the president today, the British support there, Martha, but the Secretary of State, who will talk to the Security Council next week, still has a very big job in his hands.
A very big job. Secretary Powell said today that basically what he'll talk about is an expansion of things that have already been out there. He will fill in the gaps, so to speak. He does have some new evidence. It's all circumstantial evidence. He'll pull out some charts, some graphs, probably some satellite imagery. But, Peter, I think this will be more of a comprehensive term paper.
Now, you also talked to your sources in the intelligence community based on what the president said last night. What do they say today?
The intelligence community is probably more skeptical of this than anyone. Most officials I talk to say there is no undeniable proof in Powell's presentation.
Many thanks. Martha Raddatz of the State Department today. The Pentagon announced today that another 16,000 National Guard and Reserve forces have been called to active duty. There are almost 95,000 on active duty now. And the Coast Guard said today it's going to send about 600 people and 8 patrol boats to the Persian Gulf. That will be the Coast Guard's first mobilization since the war. U.S. officials acknowledged today for the first time that there are small groups of U.S. forces already in northern Iraq. They're in areas controlled by the Kurds. They are, of course, laying the groundwork for war, and it is going on in a much, much larger scale to the south next to Iraq in Kuwait. There's been a very rapid buildup of U.S. troops there, and ABC's Bob Woodruff is on the scene.
At Kuwait's port on the Arabian Sea, long convoys pour from American ships. and onto the highway that leads north toward the desert border with Iraq. There are already at least 35,000 U.S. troops in this country, and this week the buildup has grown from a trickle to a 24-hour flow of equipment and supplies, clogging the roads, buses filled with soldiers and Marines. And here, a first glimpse of one of the places where they are heading, the vast desert staging ground for the U.S. Marine Corps.
There's more armored vehicles than I've ever seen. More vehicles than I've probably ever seen in one place.
In one place, hundreds of amphibious troop carriers, trucks, and heavy artillery guns. And Marines from the 1st Tank Battalion, who just arrived in Kuwait,
1, 2, 3, 4.
came to claim the tanks they would use in a ground assault.
Looks pretty good. She needs some love and care, but we'll get it.
I want to finally put my training to use. It's like practicing for a football game and never getting to play a game. So we're going to get to see what our training does.
This buildup is so massive, much of this equipment is not even camouflaged for the desert. About half of it is green, originally designed for the forests of Europe and South America. The Marines say in a war with Iraq they wouldn't need desert camouflage because the U.S. expects to control the skies. And since American tanks can shoot farther than Iraqi tanks, there is little fear of being hit.
If they see that tank coming down the road and it's pink, they're going to run anyway, so.
And every day here, the U.S. presence grows, bringing more fighters and firepower to the desert. Bob Woodruff, ABC News, with the U.S. Marine Corps in Kuwait.